Welcome to Tony at 12. I'm Tony LeBlanc, and today I'm in conversation with our good friend, the Prof, Professor Richard Conder. Richard has made a comprehensive study of World War One, and we're going to discuss what happened during that horrible war, which they say was the war to end all wars. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Tony. Thank you for inviting me back. It's always a pleasure.
It's a pleasure to have you on board as well. Let's have a look at the origins. And one thing that we haven't included are the Turks.
Yes, indeed.
So
Yeah.
let's start off with the European lot first, please.
Yeah. So I think whenever you're studying any war, it's worthwhile looking to see what's happened since. And as you said, war to end all wars. If I can just start off with a bit of political philosophy, to quote Marx and Hegel. So Marx quoted Hegel and said, all great world historic facts and personages appear, so to speak, twice. And Marx said, Hegel forgot to say they do appear twice, the first time as tragedy and the second time as farce.
Yeah.
Indisputably, the First World War was a tragedy. And I would suggest that the current global conflicts are a farce, because the trouble, I think the biggest problem that you have is that current generation political leaders, and perhaps it's applied in the past as well, have no understanding of history. They don't read history. And they have no understanding of war, and they carry on as if there are simple solutions through military action to major political problems. So the cause of the First World War, and here you can see reflections with the current world political scene. There were great powers, some of who were emerging, some who were declining, and some who were militaristically aggressive. So there were definitely declining superpowers, and it's always about superpowers, these world wars. The Austro-Hungarian Empire under Franz Joseph was in serious decline and fragmenting. The Russian Empire was was feudal and ruled by a Tsar who acted as if he was a god. The British Empire was just beyond its cusp, just beyond its apogee, and was struggling to maintain its empire. America was emerging as a superpower, and in particularly Germany, who under Bismarck had been unified, the federal states had been unified into one power, was growing exponentially in terms of economic power, industrial might, and ambition under a demagogic leader, Kaiser Wilhelm II, who, as one might draw comparisons now, believed that he had divine powers and could change things simply by will.
They all do this, don't they?
Yes, I would suggest that certain President Trump isn't very far away from that, as are other leaders. And yeah. I think we are in a period now of declining, some superpowers emerging, China being the obvious one, some superpowers starting to struggle, not at least economically, and that would be the USA with its massive multi-trillion-dollar debt. Russia obviously declining, and Western Europe still struggling to find a role, particularly if NATO, as it appears, might start to collapse. So there was a volatile situation in Europe, which meant it just had to have a tinder spark, which would set the whole military process into train, because there were undoubtedly plans, certainly on the German part and the French part, for confrontation. The new German under Bismarck had comprehensively defeated France in 1870, the first Franco-Prussian War, had occupied Paris and had annexed Alsace-Lorraine, and the French were hungry for revenge. So it only needed one tinderbox to get the whole thing underway.
So who shot the Duke?
Well, a chap called Princip shot the Duke. He was a Serb, and he shot Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne, emperor. The emperor of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was very, very old, almost senile. So they shot the heir to the throne. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was looking to confront the breakaway Serbs, issued them with ultimatums which were impossible for the Serbs to meet. The Serbs, who had an alliance with Russia, called on Russia to help them. Russia did. Russia mobilized. Germany mobilized in response to Russia mobilizing. France mobilized in response to Germany mobilizing. And the British, who had an alliance with both Russia and France, mobilized as well. But the British only had a tiny standing army.
So a bit like now, Richard, a bit like
indeed,
now. Yeah.
Indeed. Yeah. And probably now is much worse, to be honest.
Yeah.
We could at least put 2 divisions into the field. And we had a territorial army there of some substance. But yeah, pretty much like now. The British standing army really was there to police the empire.
Now, the irony of the whole lot here is there's a common denominator, and that's the royal family.
The royal family, yes, indeed. You're absolutely right. Kaiser Wilhelm II was Queen Victoria's grandson. Yeah. He was also, therefore, he was a cousin of King George V, and was a cousin of the Tsar. So there was family close links there. Although it seemed to make very little difference in terms of going to war. There didn't seem to be any reluctance on the part of the Germans, or I have to say the Russians, to mobilize. So in early August 1914, I will keep saying 2014, 1914.
Notice that early. Don't tell them.
The Germans put into effect the Schlieffen Plan, which was their plan for conquering France, which was a massive sweep through Belgium along the English coast to go south of Paris, and occupy Paris. In the event, and that was very successful, they ploughed through Belgium. The French had to retreat. The British, as I said, had put 2 divisions onto the field into Belgium. They fought their first battle at Mons, and then had to retreat in some disorder. Well, I think it was a well-managed retreat. It would be unfair, but they were heavily outgunned.
It wasn't Dunkirk revisited, was it?
No, it wasn't. No, but nonetheless, the French and the British were in full retreat. But the British fought a fighting retreat, and then the Germans, for some reason, von Moltke, who was then the head of the imperial staff, decided to shorten his line, and instead of swinging south of France, swung north of France into the area of the Marne. And the French rallied at that point. The French commander got his soldiers into the French taxis, the Parisian taxis, and taxied them out to the front line. And they held the German at a famous battle, the Battle of the Marne, called the Miracle on the Marne. But really that stopped the Germans advancing, but created deadlock. At that stage, both sides started to dig in, realizing they couldn't achieve a quick victory. And through 1914 and 1915, the Western Front ran from the English coast to the Swiss border in an unbroken line, manned by the Belgians. There were still some Belgians in the field. The British, who occupied only a relatively small part to start with, that was mostly in Belgium, and then the French right the way across the Somme, across the Marne, across the Vosges Mountains to the Swiss border. And then you had stalemate. Now, I've been talking at great length. Did you want to ask some questions? Because we then go on to the preliminary battles of 1915 and what led to the Battle of the Somme.
What I want to know is, at what point did the British Army realise they were so undermanned that they put in conscription?
Well, almost immediately they realised they were undermanned, but they always knew that. And the plan was that for a European war, which the British really wanted to keep out of most of the time, what the British philosophy was that they would always oppose the strongest power in Europe to protect themselves.
Yeah,
and they always knew that they would have to create a bigger army in the field, and that's what they did to start with volunteers. And most of our listeners, our viewers, and you will have seen the huge jingoistic upsurge in enthusiasm for the war in early 1914. So they were able to put into the field nearly 1 million men of volunteers. And of course, there's the famous post of Lord Kitchener, big moustache, pointing his finger, saying, "Your country needs you." And on the basis of that, they did put together a volunteer army. Mm. And you mentioned the Turks. The Turks had come in on the side of the Germans. I think we'd complicate too much to try to explain why, but it was a series of alliances. And in 1915, we'll just briefly mention this, Winston Churchill had the idea of trying to defeat Germany through Turkey, and that was the Dardanelles and Gallipoli. That ended in failure, and I think that would be for another story.
Yeah.
So the Turks never really sort of engaged in the Western Front. They had their own front line in Palestine and in Persia, now Iran. So by 1915, the biggest part of the standing British army were either dead, captured, wounded, with just a few still in the field. And there was clearly a need for a massive recruitment. That was successful. Through 1915, there were a series of British German confrontations in Belgium, most notably the first and the second battles of Ypres, Wipers, as the British called it, in Belgium. The most notable event being the second Battle of Ypres, when the Germans for the first time introduced gas. And there they were facing the Canadians. I haven't mentioned before, but the Empire supplied a huge number of highly trained and very effective soldiers to support the British Army. And that role, the New Zealand, South Africans, the Australians and the Canadians put a huge number of soldiers into the battle. So everything we're saying about the First World War includes those as very, very big part of the British Army. So the battles through 1915 really were preparatory to the big battles that were coming up when all of the protagonists were fully scaled up in terms of armaments, in terms of people, soldiers. So it really started. There were three major battles, I would suggest, perhaps four, but three that most people know about. Battle of Verdun, Germany against France. Battle of the Somme, largely Germany against British with some French involvement. And Passchendaele, the third Battle of Ypres, which was largely British Empire against Germany. We're not going to touch on Passchendaele.
No.
But the Battle of the Somme really was a direct result of Verdun. The German general, Erich von Falkenhayn, devised a plan which was not to conquer land in France, but to destroy the French army through what he called the mincing machine at Verdun. Now, Verdun was in the north of France and was strategically important to the French. They couldn't lose it. It was like a gateway to the main part of France. And Falkenhayn thought if he confronted the French army there with massive armaments, they would bleed themselves to death. And that was the plan. And it sounds brutal, but that was pretty much what he did. He didn't really try to conquer land. He just, by then, the German army had a huge number of armaments, massive number of soldiers. And that's what happened from about February 1916 right the way through to the summer. And both sides took huge casualties, and the conditions were appalling. Mud, the soldiers, what the soldiers had to fight and live, conditions they had to live in, were appalling. By around about the summer, May, June, it was clear to the French High Command, Joffre, that they would not be able to launch another battle of the Somme in combination with the British in the way that it had been planned. The Somme was designed as what was called the Big Push, and was designed to drive the Germans out of France and get the British army and the French army all the way into Germany.
So, Richard, at this point, it's trench warfare.
Purely trench warfare.
So they're all in trenches.
Yeah, all in trenches. There's no open warfare. It's really like a siege. I would say, Tony, to put it in context for the people who are watching us and listening to us, I think warfare goes in a number of phases where the offensive sometimes is in the ascendance, in the defensive at other times. Yeah. Now, clearly in the First World War, technology had so advanced that mechanization, such as the machine gun, some air power, but not much. But particular artillery. The First World War was a battle of artillery and the machine gun, the defensive. Once one side had dug in and could defend a position with machine guns, rapid rifle fire, and artillery, very difficult to get through. The Second World War was largely offensive, blitzkrieg, very, very effective air power, which culminated, of course, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but and also in the RAF and USAF bombing of Germany, which meant the attackers really were in the ascendancy. And now I would suggest, here's another parallel with 1914, the defender is back in the ascendancy. Great powers, Russia and Ukraine, America and Iran, cannot break small countries because the defensive is so effective through computerization, drones, and so on.
Yeah.
They can destroy infrastructure, which is what Russia and America are doing, respectively, in Ukraine and Iran, but they cannot defeat the other side because it is so easy to produce defensive weapons. It's axiomatic, really. They've always said you can destroy infrastructure, but the only way to conquer another place is by troops on the ground. And Russia clearly cannot get its troops into Ukraine in the numbers it needs to take Ukraine. And manifestly, the USA is very frightened about taking massive casualties in Iran, which it would do if it put troops in. So we're now in the same position in terms of defensive being in the ascendancy as they were in 1914. So the thought of a big push and a breakthrough, which was very romantic for the generals and so on, whilst it looked a good idea, and in retrospect, you can see why it wasn't, they had no reason to know that they couldn't get a breakthrough. Germany had in 1914 and then been stopped. What nobody understood was that warfare had changed because mechanization, artillery, massive industrial output, and the event of particularly of the machine gun and rapid rifle fire meant it was very difficult for troops to make progress. So that is what happened. So the Battle of the Somme had to be changed in order to be introduced in order to relieve pressure on the French army. The French army had been very nearly bled to death, and the next year, in 1917, it did actually mutiny, and they refused to attack anymore. They were prepared to defend France, but they wouldn't attack anymore. So the purpose of the Somme really was both, hopefully, a break through the German lines into Germany, end the war, the big push, and also absolutely essential to relieve pressure at Verdun on the German army, because clearly, once the Battle of the Somme started with a huge number of British troops, Falkenhayn and the German High Command had to move troops from Verdun to shore up the Somme. So the battle started on the 1st of July. It was supposed to be a couple of days earlier, but weather conditions changed that. And by then, there was a very, very big volunteer army in the field. Has to be said, it didn't have the confidence of the British High Command. They didn't believe that this volunteer army would have the ability to use their own initiative because they didn't think they were trained well enough. And they therefore planned a tactical battle, which really required the troops, the soldiers, their officers, simply to follow a set of rules and follow them to the letter. And essentially that was 7 days of massive artillery bombardment of the German lines. And the belief was that would destroy the German lines, kill the Germans, break down their defenses, in particular destroy the barbed wire. And effectively, this new volunteer army, inexperienced, never been in the field, were told, all you have to do is walk across no man's land into the German trenches and just keep going.
Yeah.
Well, that was the fatal flaw, because the reality was that the Germans, one, knew the battle was going to happen. They both had information from people who deserted, and it was self-evident from the build-up of troops on the Somme in Picardy that something very big was about to happen. So they'd created enormous defensive positions on their side of no man's land on the Somme. The Somme is chalk, and it's very easy to dig into and build huge underground caves where you can be protected. And that's where the Germans were for 7 days under a massive artillery bombardment. Some of them went mad. Even the rats left the trenches. But the actual fact was, at 7 o'clock in the morning on the 1st of July, a whistle went on the British side. The artillery stopped. and line upon line of British troops, new troops, what some would say the cream of the British Army or the British society, climbed out of their trenches undefended with packs on, heavy packs, a rifle, loads of ammunition, and were expected to walk straight across no man's land. Some places it might be 100 yards wide, some places it might be half a mile, straight towards the German trenches, which they were told would not be occupied because everybody would be dead. As soon as the artillery stopped, and unfortunately it stopped 10 minutes before 7 o'clock, the Germans knew that the British were on their way. Up they came out of their bunkers, onto their damaged trenches, set up their machine guns, and the British troops and the French troops walked straight across into a hail of machine gun fire. I should say that the configuration of the Battle of the Somme was like an L. The upright part of the L was occupied largely by the British Empire. The lower part of the L, the bottom part anyway, was the French. The original intention was it would be half and half. So the British marched forward and were cut down in droves. Many got no more than a few yards from their own trenches, and utter appalling tragedies and appalling casualties. The British lost 19,240 men killed on the first day. That's the size of a small town, a third the size of Guernsey, just about. And 57,470 casualties on that first day. It was, I don't think you can say any more than it was an unmitigated disaster for the British Army, the biggest number of casualties they'd ever suffered in one battle. And of course, most people know of the Somme as that first day. The reality is that the Battle of the Somme was a series of separate battles that ran right the way from the 1st of July into the middle of November.
Wow.
And it was a series of battles. There was some progress made by the French and the British on that bottom half of the L, where they did actually gain most of their objectives. The difficulty was lack of communication, impossible for soldiers who may have gone into the German trenches to communicate back to the staff or to their officers still in the trenches, say, need more ammunition, need more troops, we've got where we need to be. And the Germans were very good at counterattack, and they were absolutely determined as soon as the British got into their lines, they would drive them out. So they would put massive numbers of troops in and drive them out. So by the end of the first day, there have been almost no progress on the upper part of the L. You'll recognise some names, or your listeners might: Beaumont Hamel, Teepville, Gomacourt. These are all famous places on that where no progress was made whatsoever. So then, what in effect happened was it was just a slogging match through the summer of 1916 into the autumn, into it, as I said, all the way into November. Far from having a breakthrough, the British Army never actually got as far as a town called Bapaume, which was the original objective for the first day. So over those 5 months, with massive casualties, they did gain ground, inevitably 7 or 8 miles, but the losses were colossal. So the Commonwealth losses in terms of casualties over these 5 months were casualties, 420,000 casualties, of which one was my granddad, and 96,000 dead, nearly 100,000. The French lost 204,000 casualties and 51,000 dead. The Germans had less casualties, 237, because they were in the defense, but they lost 164,000 dead, most of whom were never found. Because the truth is, if you're being overrun, nobody picks your dead up.
Yeah.
And so there are massive German war cemeteries on the Somme, all of whom are unknown, with potentially 20,000 people in one grave, soldiers. The battlefield of the Somme today is an amazingly impressive place, and I would urge anybody who has any history interest in history, go to the Somme battlefields. They are extraordinary. The Somme itself, in terms of topography and geology, is fascinating. It's a beautiful place. It's chalk uplands, but the war memorials, to get a sense of the First World War and particularly the Battle of the Somme, it is the most extraordinary place. I would say much more so than Passchendaele or Verdun. Verdun is a very grim place, still is.
Richard,
And
why didn't the Royal Flying Corps act a little bit more positively in seeing what was happening?
yeah, well, first of all, we got to remember that the Royal flying was much more precarious. They did provide photographs, and they did a
Yeah.
lot of photo reconnaissance. And sometimes later on, when there was some sort of rudimentary radio, they could tell artillery that their shells were falling short or overshooting, and a lot
Mm.
of the artillery was misdirected.
Yeah.
But of course, they were always confronted by the German Air Force, Richthofen and others, and the information was always after the event in effect.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
wouldn't like to decry. I mean, they took huge casualties. The Royal Flying Corps, as it was then, didn't have parachutes. Thought it might make them too. The High Command felt it might make them sort of too easy to jump out and avoid battle. So they did take huge casualties themselves, probably pro rata, at least as much as the infantry.
And
But
what about Churchill and the tanks?
yes, well, now Churchill, who had been sacked after the Dardanelles, was brought back by Lloyd George in 2016 as Minister of Munitions. And Churchill's brand. We'd love to do one of these about Winston Churchill one day, but Churchill had just an extraordinary imagination, and he developed this idea from tractors of developing a mechanized form of artillery.
Yeah.
And so it was he who promoted the idea of tanks. And the reason they're called tanks was that it was to hide what the purpose was, so that people thought they were water tanks to bring in water up to the front line. And by in July 16, there were no tanks available, but by September, at the battle called the Battle of Flers-Courtelay, which is another one of those battles within the Battle of the Somme, they did introduce tanks for the first time. Very unreliable. I think only 3 got as far as the German lines, but one did get to a village called Flers, and there's a famous statement by one of the war poets describing and said, "There is a British tank driving down the main street of Flers with cheering British troops behind it." But it was a short-term success. The Germans actually never really developed tanks. Tanks came into their own more in 2017, and particularly in 1917 and 1918.
Yeah.
Sorry, old boys getting too excited. They were refined, but in the Battle of the Somme, they didn't play a great part. But they were introduced at the Battle of the Somme, and Churchill was their instigator, if you like. So that was significant, and obviously was the precursor to the Panzers and the British tanks now.
So what eventually overcame the Germans?
Right. Well, what we have, first of all, there was the British blockade. The British Navy, we were a sea power.
Yeah.
The Germans were a land power. The British blockade was very effective. And there's no doubt that by 1917, 1918, the Germans were suffering hunger and in some cases near to starvation. So that was very effective. By 1917, the Americans finally came in and obviously had huge resources in terms of industrial capacity and troops. They were still a relatively marginal player, even then, but what they were able to do was to give a new flood of soldiers into the battle and well-trained, well-equipped. By 1917, it was clear to the Germans they either had to win quickly or they would not be able to stand the pressure from the Americans and the British. By 1918, they had one last attack in March 1918 when the Germans, using earlier blitzkrieg tactics, drove the British back. They took all of the Somme battlefield back in virtually one day, 1918, in March. Mm-hmm. And the British had to fall back, but then they ran out of communications. They went so far, they couldn't resupply their troops. And in August of 1980, the Americans and the British, and to some extent the French, were able to counterattack and drove the Germans back. By then, the German soldiers were struggling. The French line, lack of food, lack of ammunition. They couldn't when they attacked in March. They couldn't believe the quantity of food and supplies in the British trenches that they overran. And the reality is that by 1918, the British Army was the best army in the world. And 1918, people don't. Others would disagree with me, but many would not agree. But the British Army was the best army in the world and won the First World War. By then, they had a good supply of tanks and other motorized artillery, and they were driving across green fields by then. And the Germans, who had already voluntarily retreated to the Hindenburg line, so they'd given up a lot of land earlier in 18, were just in full scale retreat, and obviously, and so you've got a German populace who was struggling with real hardships, lack of materials, lack of food, lack of ammunition, and there was starting to be, probably communist inspired, but difficult to say, starting to be upheaval within Germany itself. And so the German General Staff, Ludendorff, and name forgets, confronted the Kaiser and essentially said, we have to ask for an armistice.
Yeah.
And the Kaiser was, Hindenburg, that's who I was, the most famous general of all, Paul von Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the heads of the German General Staff, in effect, exercised a coup against the Kaiser. The Kaiser was put on a train near to the Dutch border, and Hindenburg instructed the train that night in November 1918 to cross the Dutch border, and in effect he put the Kaiser into exile, and then they requested an armistice. So that's a very obviously in between the Battle of the Somme, which was like a stalemate really, with, as I said, huge number of losses on. You then had Passchendaele, which was effectively a bloody repeat of the Somme, but in Belgium this time with in the most appalling conditions, both sides losing huge number of troops. Then you had the German counter-attack, which appeared to be successful in March 1918. Then the British and American counterattack in August, and that effectively, with the enormous amount of material that the Americans could bring to the battle, with new fresh troops, and with the British Army now being incredibly efficient. Probably the one time that the British Army in history has been the greatest army, certainly modern history, the best army in the field, effectively drove the Germans out of France, almost out of France, out of Belgium, into their own country, and that effectively was the end of the war. I think in terms of historical perspective, what happened after that was appeasement, pacifism, a sense by the Germans that they had been betrayed, which allowed Hitler, of course, to claim the Jews were responsible for betraying the German troops, which was rubbish. But there was massive inflation, massive hardship in Germany, and that, of course, gave rise to fascism, and also an understanding on the part, particularly of Germany, that the mechanized armor would be the future, and a very powerful air force. And of course, that gave them all the success to start with. And as I said earlier, effectively, the tactical advantage was in the Second World War was largely with the offensive. The Russians on the Eastern Front driving the Germans out, Germans initially making huge advances in Russia, and then the British and the American Air Force doing massive damage to the infrastructure of Germany. Whatever you think of the morality of that is the reality. But now, as I've said, repeating myself, that it seems to me it'd be interesting to hear from a much greater military expert than I would ever claim to be, or I'm not an expert at all. It does seem to be the defensive is in the ascendancy again. But I think if perhaps just worth thinking about how people view the First World War and the Battle of the Somme and the other battles. I mean, the first thing to say, I think, is it is part of the consciousness of our nation. Was taught. The reason I got really interested, while my granddad was injured and was out of the war on at the Battle of the Somme, the Battle of Bazentin Ridge. I think if he hadn't been injured, I wouldn't be here, because he most certainly would have been killed in the latter stages of the Somme or Passchendaele. So it was it was a blighty one for Grandad, but he was very severely wounded.
When
But
did
also,
he
I think
die?
sorry,
Did he
when
die
did
as
he
a
die?
result of war
No, he
injuries?
didn't. Amazingly, he lived until 1990. He was 96 when he died.
Wow, that's something else.
Um, and in about 3 years before he died, he had to have his thumb amputated because a piece of shrapnel caused gangrene in his thumb.
Oh dear.
I mean, his
Yeah.
hands were terribly, terribly distorted and damaged. And he used to have shrapnel coming out of his chest. And when I was a little boy, it would just come out and sort of get to the surface of his skin and just pop out. So I think, so in the consciousness of the nation, I think there is a good understanding of the First World War. But the memorials and the actual Battle of the Somme are an extraordinary place. The agony of the people who were left behind meant that the government and the people demanded that some sort of memorial be created. Well, the Battle of the Somme battlefield is a memorial. There are the most extraordinary architecture there to commemorate the soldiers who were never found, those who were missing, the missing on the Somme. There's a memorial by Lutyens called the Titeville Memorial, which now has a museum attached to it. It's massive. If you drive across the Somme plains, you can see this memorial almost anywhere that you want to look. And then, of course, there's the Commonwealth War Graves cemeteries, which are beautiful places of peace and still maintained every day and still have visitors every day. If you go there, there's a visitor's book. There's never a day, even in the middle of winter, when somebody hasn't visited one of these cemeteries. There's one cemetery that we visited, that we have particular affection for, called Tentry Alley Cemetery. And it is the furthest point that the British Army got to in the battle, on that particular part of the battle. And these half 12 soldiers in the snow, November, in the driving snow, through the mud, got this far and then got cut off and killed. And they were buried where they were killed. And there's this little cemetery in the middle of a field, the middle of a French field, that commemorates those 12 soldiers who got the furthest point into the German lines. And that little cemetery in the middle of a field is tended by French gardeners and by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and looks as good today as when it was first established. So they still find soldiers during farming. They still find the remains of soldiers. They still get a military burial. They did one, I think, a couple of days ago. The armaments that comes up out of the ground, the amount of munitions that were used on the Battle of the Somme, defy belief. I can't understand it, but you still find piles of shells, machine guns, clips of bullets piled up on the side of the road. When the farmers find them, they pile them up on the side of the road. Some of them used to get blown up, and then the French military collects them and blows them up.
Yeah, incredible.
So I think the collective memory of the Battle of the Somme and the First World War is still very powerful, and that's great. The memory is there. I think the tragedy is that the lessons aren't learnt.
Well, that's right, and we see this all the time. And Richard, I'm sorry to have to say, we've run out of time.
Thank you, Tony.
Said he very huskily. So we'll do another one later on in the year. It's very interesting.
That would be great.
Okay.
Thanks.
Many thanks, Richard. Appreciate it.
Bye for now. Bye-bye.